Coyote Switch wasn't the kind of town a mapmaker bragged about. It wasn't even the kind of town a mapmaker bothered to spell right. It was a pause in the New Mexico territory, out there in 1882, where the railroad cut a thin metal line through sand and scrub. A handful of wooden buildings clung to that line like tired men clinging to a promise. Tin roofs popped in the heat, boardwalks creaked under boots, and the wind, Lord, the wind had a way of moving through Coyote Switch like it owned the place, slipping between cracked boards and empty bottles, taking whatever wasn't nailed down, and some things that were. People like to talk about the West as if it was always loud, like there was gunfire every hour and a piano playing right after. But most days were quiet in a hard, stubborn way. Quiet like a man refusing to answer questions. You could hear your own breathing if you stood still long enough. You could hear the telegraph wires humming. You could hear dust skittering across the street like dry rain. That night, the wind carried the smell of burnt powder before anyone saw the first spark. It also carried something sweeter, something wrong, like blood warming up in dirt. I was just a stable boy then, Tomas Baca, small enough to get pushed aside by grown men and smart enough to stay out of their way. I'd learned early that in a town like Coyote Switch, survival wasn't about being brave, it was about being careful. So when Marshal Ellery Grout rode in with his 2 deputies, all 3 sitting tall like they'd brought the law with them in their saddlebags, I didn't run toward them. I watched from the stable doorway, and when things started to tighten, I found a barrel to hide behind. Marshal Grout was the kind of man who believed in uniforms. He had a silver star that caught lantern light like a coin catches greed. He also had that city man's stubbornness, like the world was supposed to obey just because he spoke to it loudly enough. He wasn't there for a drunk or a thief. He was there for Calder Vane. Now Vane owned the big spread outside town, water rights, grazing rights, the kind of quiet influence that makes merchants laugh too hard at jokes that aren't funny. He didn't ride into Coyote Switch every day, but when he did, the town folded around him the way cloth folds around a knife. Grout found him outside the Blue Coyote Saloon, under the hitching rail, talking to his foreman like it was just another evening. Vane wore a dark coat even in the heat, like the sun had personally offended him. When the marshal called his name, Vane turned slow and calm, like he was hearing weather, not a warning. Grout read out the charge, murder, 2 ranch hands wanted for a killing down by the arroyo. And I remember thinking, even then, that the marshal was doing something most men in town wouldn't do. Not because they didn't know right from wrong. They did. They just knew the price of saying it out loud. Vane didn't deny knowing the men. He didn't argue the law. He didn't even look particularly irritated. He just said, no. And there are different kinds of no in the territory. Some are fear, some are pride. Vane sounded like property, like he was telling the marshal he didn't have permission to reach for what belonged to him. Grout stepped closer anyway. He reached for one of Vane's men, just a hand moving forward, in official gesture, like paperwork coming to life. And the whole night seemed to stiffen around that reach. I felt it in my teeth, like thunder before it arrives. One deputy shifted his rifle, nervous. Inside the saloon, somebody laughed at something, too drunk to understand the world had changed. Then Vane's hand moved. Not fast like panic, fast like practice. It's strange what the mind remembers in a moment like that. I remember the glint of metal. I remember the lantern light jumping. I remember thinking, stupidly, that Vane looked almost bored as his pistol came up. The first shot hit Marshal Grout so clean it looked like he'd been yanked backward by a rope. His silver star flashed once, bright, almost proud, then vanished under his body in the dirt. The deputies didn't even get a full breath to decide what to do. They got halfway to drawing before they learned what on the spot really meant. Gunfire cracked against the saloon front like stones thrown at tin. Horses screamed and jerked at their reins. Men shouted, then stopped shouting. Somebody made a sound, maybe it was me, that didn't feel human when it left the throat. And then it was quiet. Not peaceful, not settled, just quiet, like the world had pulled a blanket over its head. Calder Vane stood over the bodies like a rancher looking down at a broken gate, annoyed, already calculating what it would cost him. He nodded to his foreman. Drag him aside, he said, as plain as ordering coffee. They're in the road. That's what stuck with me. Not the killing, though that stuck too, but the way he treated it like cleanup, like the road mattered more than the men. They dragged the marshal and his deputies off to the side, boots slipping in dust, bodies heavy and limp. Blood started to creep into the dirt, dark and patient, soaking in like the earth had been thirsty. The silver star on Grout's chest dulled fast, as if it was a shame to be seen. Vane holstered his pistol with that same unhurried precision and walked into the Blue Coyote Saloon. The swinging doors swallowed him. Inside, nobody stopped him. Nobody even looked him in the eye. The saloon, the town, the night, everything made room for him. I stayed behind my barrel until the lanterns burned lower. The wind kept moving through the street, tugging at loose paper, rattling sign chains, stirring dust around the blood. It was a wind I'd heard my whole life, but that night it sounded different, like it had learned something new. Far off beyond town, out toward Bonewash, where the arroyo cut the land like a scar, there came a thin, wandering whistle. Most folks said it was just air and rock. Some said it was coyotes. Some said it was spirits.
I didn't know what to call it. I only knew it didn't sound like an animal, and it didn't sound like simple wind either. It sounded like something searching the dock for a name to borrow. And standing there in the dust, smelling powder and blood, I had the cold sense that Coyote Switch had just been introduced to the kind of trouble that doesn't end with one night's shooting, the kind that settles in, the kind that waits. That whistle drifted again, soft and persistent, and I pulled my collar up against the night air like it could keep something out. Then I watched the empty street until my eyes burned, because in the West, when men like Calder Vane decide the law is optional, the rest of us learn a different rule. We learn to listen.
For 3 days after Marshall Grout fell in the street, Coyote Switch didn't feel like a town at all. It felt like a place somebody forgot to finish building. Doors stayed shut, windows stayed dark. Men still came into the Blue Coyote to drink, but they drank the way you take medicine, quick, quiet, and without enjoying it. Even the wind seemed to lower its voice, like it was listening for something better to do. Folks think fear looks like screaming and running. Out there, fear mostly looked like people doing chores too carefully, like a woman sweeping the same patch of boardwalk 3 times because she didn't want to go back inside and think, like a man fixing a fence post that wasn't broken just so his hands had a reason to shake. The town council met in the back of the feed store, where the air smelled of grain and old mouse droppings. They argued in tight circles. One wanted to send for the territorial marshal, another wanted to pay Calder Vane and call it peace. The preacher sat there too, Reverend Sloan, staring at his Bible like it might grow teeth and bite Vane for him. And me, I kept to the stable, pretending I couldn't hear any of it. But in a town that small, silence travels. You hear everything, whether you want to or not. Somebody finally said what everyone else was thinking. If Vane could shoot a marshal and walk into the saloon like it was his own parlor, then the town didn't have a law problem. It had a power problem. So they sent word out across the territory. Not a proud message, not a brave one, just a plain message with coins behind it. They were looking for men who could stand in front of trouble without blinking. On the 4th morning, 2 riders came out of the glare like they were cut from it. They didn't arrive the way drifters usually do. No swagger, no loud greeting, no showing off. They just rode in steady, calm, like the road was theirs and the day wasn't in a hurry. Their horses weren't flashy, just tough animals that had seen hard miles and learned not to panic. I watched from the stable doorway with straw stuck to my shirt, trying not to look too curious. The first man, Virgil Cole, looked like somebody built him out of dry timber and stubbornness. Lean, weathered, mustache set like it had never approved of anything in its life. He held the reins the way a man holds a loaded gun, careful, familiar, and not at all nervous. The second man, Everett Hitch, looked cleaner but not softer. His coat fit better. His posture had training in it, the kind you pick up in schools and armies. But his eyes didn't look like a soldier's anymore. They looked like a man who'd learned that orders and justice often ride different roads. They hitched their horses at the Blue Coyote and walked inside like the air belonged to them. The room went quiet so fast you could hear a chair stop creaking. The councilmen were already there, sweaty under their collars, pretending they weren't desperate. Councilman Pritchard slid a paper across the table, an offer, a contract, whatever you call it when a town tries to buy its life back. Virgil didn't even touch it at first. He stood with his hat in his hands like he was holding a bowl he might fill with lies. He said plain as day that he and Everett handled what they were paid to handle. Everett leaned in and read the paper without picking it up, eyes moving steady like he was counting risks. Then Virgil told them the part they didn't want to hear. If they wanted a marshal, they could hire one. But if they wanted peace, they had to obey him. The law, gun law, jail law, hanging law, would belong to him while he wore their badge. The councilmen didn't like that. Nobody likes handing over control, even when they've already lost it. Pritchard tried to argue they still had a council. Virgil said fine, they could still vote on potholes and schoolhouse paint. But if the town was going to survive, there couldn't be 2 men giving orders when the shooting started. They hesitated just long enough to prove they were still human. Then the wind rattled the saloon sign outside, and that sound seemed to remind them what waiting had already cost. Pritchard finally pushed the town silver star across the table, grout star, polished like you could scrub blood off a memory. Virgil pinned it to his vest without ceremony. Then he laid down one more rule. Nobody carried iron in town. Not Vane's men, not the council's men, not even friendly men who just felt safer that way. Only the marshal and his deputy, and only on duty. Somebody muttered that in New Mexico territory, that kind of rule started wars. Virgil's mouth twitched, not a smile exactly, more like a man acknowledging a fact. He said if a war was coming, better to start it on their terms. That afternoon, Virgil and Everett walked the main street together. They didn't talk much, but they moved like men who had been shot at before and survived. Everett stayed half a step behind Virgil, not hiding, just positioned, like he'd done it 100 times. They looked at faces, doorways, corners. They learned who watched and who looked away.
I remember thinking, standing there by the stable, that the two of them didn't walk like hired law, they walked like weather moving in. The test came at dusk. 3 of Vane's riders pushed into the Blue Coyote drunk and loud on purpose, boots on tables, whiskey spilling, laughing like they wanted someone to object. Each had a gun riding low on the hip like a promise. Virgil walked in and stopped where everyone could see him. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He just said, calm as a man ordering coffee, that the guns came off. Now. One of the riders smirked and said Virgil wasn't Grout. Virgil didn't flinch. He said Grout tried to negotiate. That land landed in the room like a dropped coin, small, sharp, final. The rider's hand drifted toward his pistol, lazy and insulting, as if to say the marshal could try to stop him. Everett's hand moved first, and Virgil's moved with it. 2 draws so clean you barely saw them happen. 2 shots so close together they sounded like one. The first rider fell backwards, chairs snapping under his weight. The second tried to draw and simply stopped being upright. The third froze, suddenly sober, eyes wide as if he'd forgotten what dying looked like until that moment. Virgil kept his pistol on him and told him to carry the bodies out. Then he said something I still hear when the wind gets too quiet. He told that rider to go back to Calder Vane and tell him the wind was changing. Outside, the street seemed even emptier than before. Lanterns flickered, shadows stretched long. Somebody inside the saloon started breathing again. The surviving rider dragged the dead out into the dust and stumbled away toward the darkness beyond town. No one tried to stop him. No one wanted to be the next lesson. Virgil stepped onto the boardwalk and watched him go, coat edges fluttering, badge steady on his chest like it had always belonged there. Everett stood nearby, eyes still scanning, as if the shooting hadn't ended anything, only started something with clearer rules. And way out past the last buildings, past where the town turned back into desert, that thin whistle came again from Bonewash. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It sounded like a long dry breath drawn through stone, like the land itself was paying attention, like it approved of what had happened, or maybe it was simply taking note the way it takes note of everything that bleeds into it. I stood in the stable doorway and listened until the hairs on my arms lifted. In the West, you learn fast that some sounds are just sounds, and some are warnings that don't bother to explain themselves. That night, Coyote Switch didn't feel safe, but it felt different. For the first time since Grout died, the town wasn't just waiting to be heard again. It was holding its breath for whatever Calder Vane would do next.
The morning Calder Vane rode into Coyote Switch with his men. The sun felt sharper somehow, like it had been filed down to an edge. The town had barely started breathing again after what happened in the Blue Coyote, and now you could feel that breath catch in everyone's throat. He didn't come alone. He came with 6 riders, spread around him like a collar of teeth. They moved slow, not because they were cautious, but because they wanted every set of eyes in town to watch them arrive. When a man rides like that, he isn't traveling, he's making a point. I was at the stable again, where a boy my age belonged, pretending I was busy with tack. But nobody was fooling anybody. You could hear doors closing. You could see curtains twitch. Even the dogs stayed quiet, tails down, like they remembered who owned the fear in this town. Virgil Cole was waiting out in front of the marshal's office, the badge bright on his vest, his posture loose and still. Everett Hitch stood half a step behind him, like a shadow that knew how to shoot. They didn't look like men hoping the day would go well. They looked like men who'd already decided how it would end if it went wrong. Vane dismounted like he was stepping into his own living room. Dark coat, calm eyes, that same expression he wore the night he killed Marshal Grout, like he was listening to weather, not men. "Marshal," he said, tasting the word as if it had grit in it. Virgil nodded once. "Mr. Vane." That was the thing about Virgil. He didn't raise his voice to make it stronger. He didn't add extra words to make them heavier. He let silence do the work. And in Coyote Switch, silence had plenty of experience. Vane's eyes flicked to the badge. That belonged to Ellery Grout. "It belongs to the town," Virgil said, "and the town hired me." Vane didn't deny anything. He didn't apologize. He didn't threaten outright. He stood there and let the space between them fill up with the past. Then he made it sound like he was doing Virgil a kindness. "You're new here," he said. "People misunderstand the desert. It makes men jumpy." Everett spoke, quiet as a knife sliding free. "The desert doesn't pull triggers." For a moment, you could see Vane decide whether he wanted to turn this into a story. A quick draw in the street, blood in the dust, something the town would whisper about for years. But Vane wasn't dramatic. He was practical. Men like him don't gamble unless the deck is marked. Virgil pointed at the gang. No guns in town. That's the rule. You could feel Vane's riders bristle, insulted. But Vane lifted a hand, and they held. He unbuckled his gun belt slowly, like he was demonstrating manners for a child, and handed it back to one of his men. "There," he said, thin smile on his mouth. "Now we're civilized." Virgil leaned forward just a touch. Civilized would be you coming in and answering for 3 murders. Vane's smile didn't move, but the air did. It got colder somehow, even in the sun. He said, like he was reading off a ledger, "You don't have witnesses." Virgil didn't blink. Not yet. That was the first time I saw something flicker behind Vane's eyes. Not fear, calculation, like a man recognizing a crack in a foundation. He swung back into his saddle and rode out without another word, dust rising behind him in a soft cloud. His men followed, and the town stayed still until they were gone, like everybody was afraid to move too soon and bring them back. After that, Coyote Switch had a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of surrender, the quiet of waiting.
And then, right when the day started to feel like it might settle into something almost normal, the train rolled in and brought a new kind of trouble, one that wore perfume instead of gunpowder. She stepped down onto the depot platform like she'd been expected. Her name was Adelaide Rowe. Folks would end up calling her Addie, because the West likes to shorten things. Names, tempers, lifespans. She carried herself with the sort of calm confidence you don't learn in a place like Coyote Switch. A plain dress, but it hung right. A traveling trunk big enough to tell you she wasn't broke. And a rolled cloth that looked like it belonged to a piano, though nobody in town had one worth covering. Everett Hitch noticed her first, not in the way men usually notice women after too much whiskey, more like he noticed a change in wind direction. He watched her with that careful, measuring look, as if she'd shown up with unseen paperwork tucked under her sleeve. Addie walked straight toward the hotel, asked for a room, and did it politely, like politeness was a tool she kept sharpened. The clerk tried to explain the reality of Coyote Switch. Clean and cheap didn't always ride the same horse. Virgil happened to be there at the counter, signing papers and making the town's new rules official. When Addie asked where she could stay, Virgil looked her up and down the way a rancher looks at a horse, checking for strength, checking for problems. The switch ain't clean, he told her, but it can be safe if folks behave. Addie held his gaze like she wasn't used to being spoken to in warnings. Do they? Virgil's mouth almost smiled. Almost. Sometimes they do when my friend's nearby. Then Virgil turned to Everett and told him to escort her, help her get settled. Everett did it without complaint. He carried her trunk up the stairs with steady arms and steady manners, like a man who'd learned how to behave in places with rules. Later, Everett came back down and Virgil asked what Addie wanted. Everett said, calm as ever, that she'd asked if Virgil was married. Everett told her he didn't know. Virgil's mustache twitched like it took offense on his behalf. He didn't know. Everett's eyes held a faint humor. If she's interested, she'll ask you. You might want to decide what you're going to say before the question gets you in the ribs. Virgil didn't answer right away, but the silence he wore then wasn't the same as his lawman silence. It had curiosity in it, maybe even hope, though Virgil would have denied that word if you put a gun to him. That night, Addie sat at the hotel's old upright piano, the one with chipped keys and a stubborn wheeze in the lower notes, and she played like the town had never heard her. The music filled the room and softened people without asking permission. Men who'd been tense all day sat still like boys. Even the drunkest ones lowered their voices, as if a loud laugh might break something holy. Virgil and Everett sat in the saloon nearby with drinks, listening through the open space. Virgil didn't look at her while she played, not once, which is how I knew he was thinking about her the whole time. When she finished, Addie didn't drift away with the applause the way a shy traveler would. She walked straight toward their table as if she belonged there, as if the West itself had pulled out a chair for her. You're the new law, she said to Virgil. Is it true you kill men for a living? Virgil didn't bristle. He didn't take it as an insult. He answered the way he answered most things, direct, simple, with no decoration. No, ma'am, she said. I live for a living. Killing's just what happens when men refuse to stop misbehaving. Addie smiled at that, like she liked his honesty, or maybe liked the edge of it. Then she turned to Everett with a look that made some men straighten their posture. And you, she asked. Everett's answer was choir. I try not to. She laughed softly. A man trying not to in this country, that's almost romantic. Everett didn't smile, but his eyes showed he understood her game. Addie wasn't just asking questions, she was taking the measure of men, and out in a place like Coyote Switch, measurement can be its own kind of weapon. Outside, the wind lifted again, pushing dust along the street, rattling loose boards, and from far off, beyond the last buildings, beyond where town became desert, there came that thin whistle from Bonewash. It slid into the night like a stray thought you can't shake. Addie paused mid-breath, head tilting slightly, as if she'd heard it too. What's that? She asked. No one answered right away. The room stayed still for a beat, like everybody was hoping it would stop if ignored. Virgil finally said, just the land talking. But I'd been down near Bonewash before, and I didn't believe it was just the land, not entirely. Addie's eyes searched the shadows by the door, then came back to Virgil. Her expression didn't show fear exactly, more like interest, like a person hearing a new kind of music and deciding whether to dance. That was the way Coyote Switch felt then, like a dance had started, slow and dangerous, and nobody was sure who was leading. Calder Vane had tested Virgil and went away, not satisfied but not ready to spill blood in the open. Virgil had drawn a hard line in the dirt and dared the town to stand behind it. Everett watched every angle like he could already see tomorrow's trouble arriving. And Addie arrived like a spark in dry grass, smiling, listening, deciding. And somewhere out there, Bonewash kept whistling, thin and patient, as if it knew the desert always gets the last word.
Bonewash earned its name the honest way. Not from legend, not from a preacher's warning, but from what the desert left behind when it was finished with things. An arroyo north of town, dry most of the year, then suddenly violent when flash floods came. Its bends and narrow cuts collected whatever the land didn't want to carry anymore. Cattle bones, broken wagon parts, and once in a while, something a little more personal. When the wind moved through Bonewash, it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a thin, wandering whistle, as if the rocks had learned how to breathe through teeth. Most folks in Coyote Switch pretended they didn't hear it. They said it was just air and stone, or coyotes playing tricks, or nothing worth naming. But Tomas Baca, the stable boy, had been down there once chasing a mule, and he came back with the feeling that the place remembered people. Not kindly, just accurately. After Virgil Cole pinned on the badge and the saloon floor got scrubbed clean of blood, the town tried to act like it could return to normal. Men went back to their work, women hung laundry, the blacksmith kept hammering iron, but every sound felt like it happened under a held breath. That's when Otto Krieger came stumbling in. Otto was a German miner,
white, hard-used, beard full of dust, and his hands split from picks and stone. He wasn't the type to spook easy. He'd lived under mountains and crawled into holes in the earth for a handful of ore. But the day he walked into Coyote's Switch, he looked like the desert itself had chased him. He asked for the marshal. Virgil brought him into the office and shut the door. The marshal's place was 3 rooms of stale air, old ink, and wood that had soaked up too many worries. Everett Hitch stood nearby, quiet as ever, watching Otto the way you watch a rattlesnake you don't want to startle. Otto didn't sit right away. He stood there with his hat in his hands, fingers twisting the brim until it creaked. "I seen it," he finally said. His accent made the words heavy. "De night Grout died. I was behind the water barrels. I seen Calder Vane shoot him like shooting a dog." Everett's posture tightened. "Why come now?" Otto's throat worked, dry as cotton. "Because they came to my shack last night, Vane's men. They didn't say words. They just stood there, and one of them whistled." That made the room go a little colder, even in daylight. Otto swallowed again. It sounded like bone wash. Virgil didn't interrupt. He just waited, eyes steady, letting Otto get the truth in one piece. "And then," Otto continued, "they left a little sack on my table." Everett asked, calm but edged, what was in it. Otto's mouth trembled. He looked down like he couldn't bear to see his own memory. "A deputy's ear." The words hung there, heavy, real, not the kind of thing you argue with. Otto had brought the sack with him. He held it tight, as if letting go might make the contents breathe. His fingers moved toward the twine. Virgil lifted one hand, stopping him, not because Virgil didn't believe him, because he already did. A man didn't need to look at what was in that sack to know what kind of message it was. Virgil said, "You'll testify." Otto's head snapped up. Panic flashed across his face. "They'll kill me." Virgil's voice didn't soften, but it wasn't cruel either, just plain. "They might try, but if you don't testify, they already did." Otto stared at the floor a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow and final, like a man signing his own death warrant with a steady hand. That afternoon, Virgil and Everett rode out. Tomas watched them leave from the stable doorway. The 2 lawmen moved like they had all the time in the world, but the town could feel what they were doing. They were pulling on the wire that held Calder Vane's world together, and everyone knew a wire like that can cut. Vane's ranch set out beyond town, where the land spread wide and dry, with fences stretched thin, and men riding it like patrols. Virgil and Everett found him working near a corral, not in some grand house, but out in the machinery of his own kingdom. Calves bawled, dust rose. Men moved with that steady rhythm of ranch work, as if nothing in the world could reach them there. Calder Vane stood by a fence with his foreman, ledger in hand, counting something. Always counting. Virgil rode straight in and dismounted without ceremony. Dust lifted around his boots. Calder Vane, you're under arrest for the murder of Ellery Grout and his deputies." The ranch hand stiffened. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't drama, but it was a match held close to dry grass. Vane looked up slowly, eyes cool. On what evidence? Everett's pistol was already out, leveled at Vane's chest with a steadiness that said he didn't enjoy this and wouldn't hesitate anyway. "A man who saw," Virgil said. For the first time, Vane's calm cracked, not into fear, into calculation. His gaze slid across Virgil, Everett, the distance to his men, the angle of the corral rails, the way sunlight hit dust and made visibility tricky. It wasn't the look of a man thinking about innocence. It was the look of a man measuring outcomes. "You ride in here and point guns at me," Vane said, "and you think you ride out?" Virgil stepped closer, pressed his pistol barrel into Vane's ribs, and spoke low enough that only Vane could hear it. "Tell them to stand down." A rifle came up too high among the ranch hands. Someone's breath caught. The foreman tensed like he might gamble the whole ranch on one shot. Vane held still for a beat, jaw working, then he lifted a hand. "Easy," he said. Reluctantly, rifles lowered, hands came away from holsters. Men who wanted to be brave decided to be alive instead. Virgil stripped Vane's gun belt. Everett moved behind him and cuffed him with a short chain. Nothing fancy, just iron links that didn't care who you were. Vane didn't fight. He didn't curse. He didn't plead. He moved the way a man moves when he believes the world will correct itself back in his favor. As they escorted him back toward Coyote Switch, the ranch hands watched from the corral like dogs forced to sit. Vane rode between Virgil and Everett with his wrists chained and his posture almost comfortable. Tomas would later swear he saw Vane smiling faintly, as if arrest was just another delay in a day full of appointments. Back in town, the street filled with cautious faces. People stood on boardwalks and in door vents, trying not to look like they were hoping for something. When Virgil brought Vane past the stable, Tomas felt his stomach knot.
It wasn't just the sight of a prisoner. It was the sense that a storm had been bottled, and someone had put the bottle on a shelf too flimmy to hold it. Otto Krieger was waiting near the marshal's office, pale as chalk. He looked like a man who'd been promised a hanging and was just waiting to see what kind of rope they used. Vane noticed him immediately. As Vane passed, he turned his head and stared at Otto with that slow, cold focus of a man selecting livestock. "You're dead," Vane said broadly, almost pleasantly. Otto's knees nearly buckled. Virgil leaned in toward him as he guided Vane inside. "As long as you testify," Virgil told him, "you're under my protection." Vane was locked up, the saloon floor clanged shut, the iron latch slid into place with a final sound that felt satisfying for about half a second. Then the night arrived, the satisfaction drained away. Otto didn't sleep. He sat in his rented room fully dressed, staring at the door as if expecting it to open by itself. The lamp flame trembled each time the wind pressed against the window. He held his hands together so tight his knuckles turned white, as if he could squeeze courage out of bone. Tomas didn't sleep either. He lay in the stable loft under a blanket and listened to the town settle into darkness. Lantern light bobbed from window to window. Somewhere a horse shifted in its stall. Far off, the desert made its own noises, small, dry sounds that didn't feel friendly. Later, Tomas saw lantern light moving near the edge of town. Not the steady light of a man walking home. A quieter light, a cautious light. Shapes in the dark, too careful. And then, from beyond the last buildings, beyond the line where the street became sand, the thin whistle drifted in from Bonewash again, longer this time, like someone practicing a tune. Tomas pulled his blanket up to his chin and tried to tell himself it was only wind and rock. But the whistle didn't feel like weather. It felt like waiting. And in Coyote Switch, everyone understood waiting. It was what came right before the next thing broke.
The trial was held in the schoolhouse because it was the only place in town big enough to cram everyone inside and still leave a little room to breathe. And even then, breathe is generous. The air was hot and close, thick with sweat, dust, and that quiet fear people carry when they're watching the law try to prove it still has teeth. A judge rode down from Santa Fe for it. He looked stiff, sunburned, and already sick of the territory, like he'd been counting the days until he'd go back somewhere that didn't smell like horses and gunpowder. He brought 2 federal deputies with him, clean shirts, hard collars, the kind of men who believed forms and signatures could stop a bullet if you held them up straight. Virgil accepted their help the way he accepted weather. No gratitude, no complaint, just a quick look at the sky and a decision about what came next. Everett watched those deputies like he watched a new horse, polite on the surface, but ready for a kick if it came. When Otto Krieger took the stand, the whole room leaned in. Otto's voice shook, but his story didn't. He told it plain. He described Grout's stepping forward. He described Vane's hand moving, quick, practiced. He described the shots, the suddenness of them, the way the street went quiet right after, like the town itself didn't understand what had just happened. And then he talked about the ear and the sock. Even saying it out loud made people shift and swallow. Otto tried to show it too. The judge stopped him before he could. The judge's face tightened like he'd stepped in something foul, and he said the court wouldn't be turned into a circus. Calder Vane sought their calm through all of it, hands folded, back straight. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a businessman waiting for a meeting to start, the kind who expects the room to apologize for running late. And when it was his turn to speak, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just wore this soft, offended tone, like the whole thing was an inconvenience. "A man like me," he said, "I don't shoot marshals in the street. I pay lawyers." A few folks laughed nervous and quick, like laughter could drain the poison out of the words. Others didn't laugh at all. They just stared, unsure whether it was a joke or a promise. Then right when the town thought it had settled into the shape of the trial, 2 new riders came in and the air changed. They were brothers, Quinn and Ezra Morrow, hired gunmen from further west. You could tell what they were the moment you saw them, not because they looked wild, but because they looked too neat for a place like ours. Clean lines, easy smiles, eyes that didn't hold anything warm. They carried themselves with that relaxed grace men get when violence has become normal to them, like rain, like heat, like the way a day always ends in night. Virgil saw them from the marshal's office window and didn't even blink. No surprise, no panic, just that same steady look he always wore when trouble showed up wearing boots. He walked out to meet them under the hitching rail. "No guns in town," Virgil said. Quinn Morrow grinned like he'd been offered something amusing. "We heard." Ezra didn't grin. His gaze just slid over Virgil's badge, slow and measuring. "We also heard you're quick." Virgil's voice stayed flat. "You heard right." Quinn leaned in a little, friendly as a snake in warm grass. "We're just passing through." "Pass," Virgil said. And the Maras did something that almost would have looked respectful if it hadn't been so theatrical. They unbuckled their gun belts and hung them on their saddles with exaggerated care, like men demonstrating obedience to a child, like they wanted everyone watching to know they could follow the rules if they felt like it. Everett stood a few steps behind Virgil, hands loose at his sides, ready without looking ready.
I noticed Everett's eyes weren't on their faces, not even once. He watched shoulders, hips, wrists, those tiny preparatory movements a man makes before he decides to kill. That night, the town couldn't settle. Even the saloon sounded different, like the laughter kept tripping over itself. Virgil stepped out back for air and quiet, and that's where Addie Rowe found him. Addie didn't hesitate the way most people did around Virgil. She walked up like she belonged there, like warnings were just another kind of invitation. "They say you're going to hang Caldervane," she said. Virgil didn't turn at first. "Judge will decide." Addie's voice softened. "And if the judge does?" That made Virgil look at her. His eyes were tired in the deep way, like he'd already seen the ending to things and just had to live through the middle. "Then the rope will be the least ugly part," he said. Addie studied him like she was reading something written small. "You talk like a man who doesn't believe in happy endings." Virgil's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I believe in endings. Happy's just rare." Addie took a step closer, close enough that perfume tried to compete with dust and lost. "Rare things are worth chasing," she said. Virgil didn't move away. He didn't move closer either. He just held steady like he was bracing against a wind that hadn't hit yet. "You should be careful what you chase in a place like this," he told her. Addie smelled faintly like she liked warnings more than she liked permission. Then she reached up and adjusted his collar, small, intimate, almost domestic, like she was claiming a space on him without ever saying the words. Everett saw it from across the street. He didn't look hurt. He looked thoughtful, like a man watching a plan shift by half an inch and deciding whether it could still hold together. The next morning, the judge delivered the verdict, guilty. You could feel the schoolhouse exhale as one body. Some folks cried, quiet and relieved, like they'd been holding grief in their throats for days. Others just stared at Calder Vane, waiting for him to turn into something obviously monstrous, something that would make all this make sense. But Vane didn't change. He simply nodded, like he'd been told a price and was deciding whether he wanted to pay it. The judge declared Vane would be transported by rail to Las Vegas, New Mexico. Not some shining place, just an old town with a jail that could hold a man like Vane until somebody built a gallows solid enough to do the job. People filed out in a slow, uneasy stream. Otto Krieger stood near the door looking pale, like he'd stepped out of his own body and wasn't sure how to get back in. Everett walked past him and murmured, low enough most wouldn't hear, "Stay close to the deputies." Otto nodded like a man who'd rather hug a rattlesnake than be left alone. Virgil started arranging the transfer right away, because that's what Virgil did. He didn't celebrate, he didn't rest. He moved to the next hard thing before the last hard thing had even cooled. Out by the deputies, the Morrows lounged like they had nowhere else to be, too casual, too patient. Men like that don't come just passing through. They come when someone pays them to arrive at the right time. I watched all of it with a tight feeling in my chest, because the guilty verdict didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the moment right before a match touches the fuse. The wind picked up that afternoon, drifting through town like it was practicing a whistle, like it was rehearsing for what it knew was coming.
The train heading east was a short one. 2 passenger cars up front, then a freight car, and finally a cattle car that still carried the sour smell of old fear. Calder Vane rode in that cattle car, under guard, his wrists chained, his posture almost comfortable, like a man who had learned how to wait. Virgil stayed in the same car with him, sitting on a crate, a shotgun resting across his knees. He looked relaxed if you didn't know him. Everett rode the next car over, keeping to the roof, watching angles, watching distance, watching for anything that didn't belong. Addie Rowe had insisted on seeing Virgil off. She stood on the depot platform in a pale dress, too bright for a place like that, a clean thing against dust and sun-bleached wood. As the engine hissed and groaned, her eyes stayed locked on his. "Come back alive," she said. Virgil answered quietly, almost like it was just between them. "You too." The train rolled out, iron wheels grinding forward, and Coyote Switch shrank behind them until it was nothing but a smear of sunlight and dust. For the first hour, nothing happened. Just the steady rhythm of the rails, the creak of wood and metal, the desert stretching out on both sides like it had no end. Then the train slowed for a water stop. One of those lonely tanks in the middle of nowhere, where the land looked so empty it felt staged, like a backdrop waiting for actors. Men climbed down to work the pump. Metal clanged. Steam rose in pale drifting sheets, ghostly in the heat. Virgil felt his instincts tighten. He stood, stepped to the open door of the cattle car, and scanned the low ridgeline beyond the tracks. Everett shifted on the roof of the next car, rifle ready, eyes moving in calm practice sweeps. And then, Addie screamed. Not from the platform, that was miles behind them now. This scream came from the sand beside the tracks. Virgil's head snapped toward the sound, and there she was. Addie Rowe, right there in the desert, held upright by an arm locked around her throat. A pistol was pressed hard against her temple. Her dress was dusty now, her hair was loose, a little wild. Her eyes were bright with terror that might have been real, or might have been useful. Quinn and Ezra Morrow stood with her, grinning like they'd just finished a clever trick. "How's that for a surprise?" Quinn called out. Virgil felt his stomach drop, heavy and sudden. His mind raced even as his face stayed still. He searched for the trick, the missing piece, how she'd gotten here, why. Ezra raised his voice. "Open the door, Marshal, or she falls quiet." Everett's rifle sight settled on Ezra's chest, steady as stone, but Addie's head was in the way. Everett's finger tightened, then eased. Control. Always control. Virgil stepped down from the car, boots sinking into the sand. The shotgun stayed in his hands, but he didn't raise it. His voice was calm, even. "What do you want?" Quinn laughed. "You know what we want. You got our employer in chains."
Inside the cattle car, Calder Vane finally smiled. It was small, satisfied. Virgil's jaw clenched. He's convicted. Ezra pressed the pistol harder against Addie's temple. And she's pretty. Addie's eyes found Virgil's. Her lips parted. Her voice trembled. Virgil. Everett's voice carried from above, calm but edged sharp. Cole, don't. Virgil didn't answer him, not because he hadn't heard, but because hearing didn't solve anything. He had a patch, he had a prisoner, and he had a woman he'd started to imagine inside the unfinished house he was building back in town, walls still raw, nails still bright. That image had weight now, heavy as a coffin lid. Virgil maced one hand. Let her walk away. Quinn shook his head slowly. First you unlock him. The desert went quiet. Just the hiss of steam, the low murmur of the engine waiting. Virgil stared at Calder Vane through the open car door. Vane met his eyes with a look that said everything without a word. You don't own me. You never did. Virgil's shoulders rose and fell once. Then he stepped back into the cattle car, reached down, unlocked the chain, and stepped out again. Calder Vane rubbed his wrists like a man freed from boredom, not danger. The Morrows released Addie and swung her up onto a horse that had been waiting just out of sight. Vane mounted another. Quinn tipped his hat toward Virgil. Much obliged, Marshal. Then they rode off into the desert, Addie between them. She wasn't fighting hard enough to convince Everett, but she was trembling enough to convince Virgil. Everett jumped down and landed beside him. Weakened still. I cut him off. Get back on the train. Get horses in town. I'll track them. Everett hesitated. On foot. Virgil's eyes stayed on the riders, already shrinking into the heat. They're leaving sign. They want me to follow. Everett's gaze hardened. Then it's a trap. Virgil nodded slightly. His voice was low. Most things are. He stepped away from the tracks and into the sand, walking straight into the heat like a man heading toward his own execution. Behind him, the train hissed, impatient to leave. Everett watched Virgil's back for a long moment, then turned and climbed aboard, his expression set like a decision already made. The wind rose again, slipping through metal and wood. The water tank began to sing, a thin bone-like whistle that seemed to laugh quietly at human plans.
Everett came back at dawn the next morning with fresh horses, pushing them hard enough that foam clung to their flanks. He didn't waste time explaining. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. Whatever happened out there, Virgil was already in the middle of it. Finding Virgil's trail wasn't difficult. Virgil never bothered to hide his tracks. He'd always believed that if a man wanted you, he'd find you anyway, and if he didn't, then you didn't need to waste your life pretending. The trail ran northeast, cutting toward a place folks called Bonewash, where the land cracked open into gullies and stone ribs, and the wind always sounded like it had something to confess. They rode for hours without much talk, just saddle creak, hoofbeats, and that wide desert silence that makes you feel small on purpose. Every so often, Everett would slow and lean down, studying the ground. And then he started noticing things that didn't feel natural. Hoofprints pressed too clean into soft sand, as if someone wanted them noticed. A snapped twig laid just so, not random, more like a finger pointing. Finally Everett said it, quiet but certain. They're guiding us. Virgil didn't even turn his head. Polite of him. By midday they saw smoke near a bend in the river, a thin gray thread stitched into the sky. They eased off their horses and moved in careful, using scrub and rocks for cover, closing the distance the way men do when they're expecting trouble and hoping they're wrong. But when they got close enough to see, trouble wasn't what they found first. Addie Rowe was in the river, naked as the day she was born, laughing while Quinn Morrow splashed water at her like they were old sweethearts on a picnic. It wasn't a hostage scene. It wasn't even some crude display meant to scare Virgil. It was worse than that. It was easy. Addie looked comfortable there, like a woman settling into whatever room she happened to be offered, no matter who owned the house. Virgil went still, not stiff with anger, not shocked, just still, like something inside him had locked into place. Everett didn't speak either. The silence between them felt old, heavy, and private, like two men sharing the same thought and neither wanting to be the first to say it out loud. Then the world shifted. A flicker of motion on the ridge beyond the river, shadows sliding between rocks, the faint glint of metal, the curve of bows coming up. A band of Apache scouts, close enough now that you could see the paint on their faces blending with dust tones, their eyes hard and flat with purpose. They'd come in like ghosts, no sound, no warning. The air tightened. Not like fear exactly, like a wire pulled to the point before it snaps. One scout rushed down fast toward the river and grabbed for Addie's arm, and Addie screamed, sharp, loud, sudden, convincing, the kind of scream that turns your blood to ice and makes you move before you even decide to. Virgil and Everett emerged as one. Gunfire cracked across the water. A horse went down somewhere with a horrible shriek, kicking and thrashing in the sand. The scout released Addie and dove back toward cover.
More figures showed themselves along the ridge, enough of them that you could feel the odds shifting with every heartbeat. Quinn Morrow yanked Addie up out of the river and shoved a blanket into her hands. Ezra dragged Calder Vane behind rocks, keeping him low, keeping him alive, because Vane was the reason any of them were here in the first place. For a few seconds, it looked like the desert might take all of them at once. Lawmen, outlaws, the man they'd convicted, and the woman who seemed to belong to whoever was holding her at the moment, everybody bleeding into the same patch of sand. Virgil raised his voice, sharp and clear. "We don't want to fight with you." A scout shouted something back in Apache, quick, clipped words that sounded like stones striking together. Everett lowered his rifle a fraction, not surrender, just enough to show he was listening. Then he spoke in broken phrases, careful, respectful, not trying to be clever. He gave them what he could. They were passing through, shots were fired, no insult intended, no claim on this land. The leader hesitated. His gaze moved, assessing. He noticed Calder Vane's horse, a fine animal with a bright white blaze on its face, dancing nervous circles behind the rocks. And Everett made a decision so fast it barely looked like one. He nodded toward that horse and called out simple and direct, "Take it, for trouble." Virgil glanced at him, surprised, but he didn't argue, not now, with arrows and rifles aimed down from the ridge. The Apache leader studied Everett's face, then looked at the horse again, then back up toward the ridge where his men waited like drawn bows. Finally, he made a small gesture with his hand. The tension didn't vanish, not really. It just stepped aside. The scouts withdrew into the rocks, taking the horse's payment, melting away the way bad dreams do, sudden, silent, and without any explanation you can hold on to afterward. When the last shadow disappeared, Virgil stepped out from cover. He didn't relax. He just shifted his weight like a man preparing for the next problem. Quinn Morrow grinned wide like he'd enjoyed the excitement. "Well," he said, dusting his hands like it had all been entertainment, "ain't that neighborly?" Virgil's eyes were cold, guns back. Ezra lifted an eyebrow. "You sure?" Virgil didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You want to live long enough to spend Vane's money, you'll take your guns and walk." For the first time since they'd ridden into town, the Morrows looked uncertain. They'd expected fear, or rage, or pleading, something emotional he could play with. Instead, Virgil gave them terms. He handed their pistols back, not as kindness, as strategy. A man without a gun, when he's cornered, tends to do stupid things. A man with a gun might do smart things if he believes you'll put him down the second he tries anything. By nightfall, they were moving again, together in the same direction whether they liked it or not, an uneasy caravan stitched together by circumstance. Virgil and Howard up front. Calder Vane kept close, protected by the very men who'd brought him to this point. The Moor was watching everything. Addie wrapped in a blanket, hair drying in the firelight, acting like nothing had happened that couldn't be explained away later. They made camp with the kind of caution you don't talk about. Low voices, short glances, everyone pretending the dark beyond the fire wasn't full of eyes. Addie sat close to Virgil, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his arm, like proximity alone could erase what he'd seen at the river. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "I was scared." Virgil didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames as if he could read something there. The fire popped and shifted, throwing light up into his face, and you could see how tired he looked, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many endings around in his head. Then he asked Everett without looking at him, "You think she'll do it again?" Everett didn't hesitate. His reply was quiet, honest, and sharp enough to cut. "She'll go where she feels safest, or where she feels strongest. Sometimes those have the same place." Addie's head snapped toward Everett. Her eyes flashed with anger, with panic, with calculation. Maybe all of it at once. "Don't listen to him," she said. "He tried to touch me back at the house. He's always wanted." Virgil's gaze shifted to her slowly, heavy as a closing gate, and he said one word. "No." Flat, final, like a door being shut and locked. Addie's expression wavered, just for a moment, then hardened into something like offended dignity. She looked away, hugging the blanket tight around herself, suddenly smaller than she'd seemed all day. Quinn Morrow chuckled under his breath. "Well," he murmured, "ain't family dinner lively?" Everett didn't smile. He didn't respond. He just watched the dark beyond the firelight, where the desert waited like an animal that never truly sleeps. And somewhere out there, the wind found a narrow cut in the land and whistled soft and steady, Bonewash calling again, patient as death.
They reached the rail siding called Cedar Switch 2 days after the river, and it didn't feel like a town so much as a place the world had forgotten to finish. A water tank, a few stock pens, a telegraph key, and one narrow building that called itself a jail. The wind moved through the boards like it owned them. Virgil Cole rode in first, stiff in the shoulders, eyes steady. Everett Hitch rode beside him, breathing careful from old bruises and new worry. Between them, kept close and watched closer, was Silas Bragg, no longer in chains, not exactly, but not free either. The hired guns were dead now, the river scare still fresh, and everyone in that little group carried the same feeling. The land had been patient long enough. Cedar Switch had a marshal. His name was Redden, and he stepped out to meet them under that too bright sun with neat boots and a badge that looked like it had never been tested. "Marshal Cole," Redden said, smiling quick. "Word travels." Virgil didn't offer friendliness. "So I hear." Redden's eyes slid to Bragg. "That him?" Everett answered before Bragg could. "That's him."
Bragg stood calm, like a man waiting for a carriage. His face carried the mild annoyance of someone delayed, not the fear of someone captured. That was Bragg's gift. Even when the world put a collar on him, he acted like the collar was temporary. The moment stretched. Teo Luhan, watching from behind his own memory of it later, would always say the air felt wrong right there. Not loud wrong, quiet wrong, like a room that's been cleaned too well after something ugly. Redden gestured toward the stock pens. "Office is this way," he said. "We'll hold him here until transport." Virgil nodded once, but he didn't relax. Everett didn't either. Everett's eyes kept moving. Roof lines, corners, shadowed gaps between boards. He watched the place the way a man watches water for snakes. They walked through the stockyard in the open, and it was too exposed for comfort. Fence boards creaked. A few crows perched on rails, their heads tilting as if they were listening for gunfire the way other creatures listen for rain. Halfway to the office, Everett caught something. Just a small glint on the feed shed roofline. Not sunlight on a nail, something straighter. A rifle barrel. Everett didn't shout. He didn't grab. He simply touched Virgil's elbow, a warning you could miss if you weren't trained to feel danger with your skin. And then the trap sprang. The first shot cracked from the feed shed. Wood exploded into splinters near Virgil's shoulder, sharp as wasps. Another shot came from the far corner of the pens. Dust jumped off the ground in little puffs, like the earth itself was flinching. Redden moved sideways, too smooth, too practiced, and drew his gun. Not toward Bragg, toward Virgil. So that was the truth of it. Family, money, or both. A badge that wasn't a badge so much as a costume. Cedar Switch wasn't a stop on the way to justice. It was the place they'd planned to bury it. Virgil didn't dive. He didn't scramble. He moved with that clean economy that made him so dangerous. A half step, a turn, his pistol already clearing leather like it had been waiting for permission. Everett fired first. One shot, flat, precise, and the rifleman on the feed shed vanished out of sight as if someone had yanked him down by the ankles. Virgil fired a heartbeat later. Redden took the bullet in the chest and staggered back, surprise blooming across his face like he couldn't believe the world had answered him. He fell into the dust, his badge catching the light once before it went all. The stockyard erupted. More shots, more splintering boards, cattle bawling and surging against the rails. Men shouted things nobody would remember clearly afterwards. Virgil stayed centered, picking targets the way a man picks locks, quick, exact, without panic. Everett shifted with him, covering angles, ending threats before they became stories. In the middle of it, Bragg made his move. That's what Bragg did. He didn't fight like a desperado. He escaped like a businessman. He used confusion like a tool, like a door someone had left open for him. He knocked a pen gate loose and slipped through a press of cattle, shoulders turned sideways, moving with the certainty of a man who had rehearsed this in his head more than once. He headed straight for a horse, tied and saddled as if it had been waiting all day for exactly this moment. Everett lunged toward him, but the distance was wrong and the world was too loud. His hand caught only air. Virgil fired once at Bragg as Bragg swung up into the saddle, close enough that the shot shaved the line between miss and miracle, but Bragg kicked the horse hard and vanished down the siding road in a spray of dust, disappearing the way bad men often do, fast, without paying the full price. When the last gunshot faded, Cedar Switch went still in a way that felt unnatural. Cattle lowed, boards creaked, the wind rubbed itself along the pens like it was trying to erase what had happened. Virgil stood in the dust, breathing hard. Blood ran down his arm from a graze near the shoulder. Everett pressed a hand to his ribs, wincing once, face tight but controlled. Lark French, wrapped in a travel cloak, eyes bright with shock, rushed toward Virgil. Virgil didn't turn to her right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the road where Bragg had disappeared, on that thinning curtain of dust. "He's loose," Virgil said. It wasn't an outcry, it was a fact, like stating the sky was high and the desert was wide. Everett echoed it softly. Loose, but alone now. That's a change. Virgil finally looked at Everett. "You all right?" Everett gave a small nod. "I've been worse in better towns." They bound their wounds with torn cloth and stubborn hands. Cedar Switch didn't have a doctor worth the name, and the kind of men who needed doctors out here rarely got them in time anyway. Virgil wired Rio Seco with a message so short it felt like it couldn't possibly hold the weight of the truth. Bragg escaped. The hired guns were dead. Hold the town. Then they rode back the long way. Straight lines were for people who believed the land cared about fairness. Teo saw them return on the third day, dust caked and stiff, riding like men whose bodies were still arguing with what they'd asked of them. Mrs. Aranda took one look and didn't ask questions. She sat them down, boiled water, tore clean cloth, and did what women in the West did when men brought home violence. She made survival into a series of quiet tasks. The town greeted them with a strange mix of gratitude and dread. Gratitude because the worst of the hired killers would never smile in Rio Seco again. Dread because Bragg was loose, and a loose Bragg was worse than a caged one. A caged Bragg had to pretend to be civilized. A loose Bragg could be honest. Weeks passed. Virgil healed into a permanent stiffness in his shoulder. Everett's rib wound closed, leaving him with an ache that flared when the weather shifted. The days returned to routine, but the routine had a crack running through it now, and everyone felt it underfoot. Lark settled back into town as if nothing had happened that couldn't be handled by a clean dress and steady eyes. She played the piano again. She laughed in the saloon. She sat beside Virgil at dinner like she had always been there, like the river and the knives and the screaming were just a bad dream that didn't deserve daylight. Virgil began building a small house on the edge of town. Teo watched him work, hammering boards, squaring corners, setting posts with the same careful precision he used when he laid down laws. It was unsettling in a way Teo couldn't explain. Seeing the fastest gun in the territory measure nails and level beams made the world feel briefly less chaotic, like maybe straight lines could exist after all. Everett watched too, but from a distance. He watched the house the way he watched Lark, like a thing that might be beautiful, but might also shift the moment you leaned on it. One evening, Teo found Everett outside the marshal's office, staring toward the horizon where the land turned blue and uncertain. "You think he'll stay?" I asked, before I could talk myself out of it. Everett didn't look at him at first. "Virgil," he said. Teo nodded. Everett's voice came out soft. "He wants to," he said. "Wanting is a strong rope." Teo hesitated, then asked the question that had been rattling around his skull for days. "And her?" Everett's eyes crest slightly, not with anger, more like focus. "She wants a roof," he said, "and a name that means something." Then he glanced at Teo, and his gaze carried the tired clarity of a man who'd seen too many towns change hands without a single shot fired. "People like us," Everett said. "We build meaning out of small things because the land doesn't give it freely." Teo didn't fully understand. Not yet. But he felt the shape of it, like a shadow passing over sun. The wind moved through Rio Seco and made the new boards on Virgil's half-built house creak softly, as if the house itself were learning to speak. And out beyond the town, somewhere in that wide, patient desert, Bragg was still breathing, free, angry, and heading toward whatever came next.
The news arrived in Rio Seco the way bad weather does, quiet at first, then all at once. It came in a clean envelope with sharp corners, carried off the afternoon train by a man who looked like he didn't want to touch it. He walked it straight to the marshal's office and handed it over like it might burn his fingers. Virgil Cole opened it in front of witnesses, not because he liked an audience, but because secrets spread faster than truth in a town like this. Everett Hitch stood close by, watching Virgil's face more than the paper, because paper didn't matter as much as what it did to a man. Virgil read without moving, and when he finished, he didn't curse, he didn't slam the letter down, he just held it up so everyone could see the seal, the careful handwriting, the authority pressed into ink. "It's a pardon," Virgil said. The room shifted. Someone sucked in a breath like they'd been hit. "For who?" Cobb the merchant asked, voice tight. Virgil lifted his eyes. Silas Bragg. That name landed heavy, like a shovel heading packed earth. The banker made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's impossible." "It's official," Virgil said. "Signed Ive Washington." Everett didn't speak right away, but his hands tightened once, barely, and then relaxed again, like he caught himself wanting to break something. The letter was full of those polished phrases officials used when they wanted distance from consequences: insufficient evidence, procedural concerns, petitions from prominent citizens. It read like a door quietly closing on everything Rio Seco had bled for. Mrs. Aranda stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes sharp. "So the paper says he can come back," she said. Virgil nodded once. She looked around the room at the men who claimed to represent the town. "And what does the town say?" No one answered. Because Rio Seco didn't have one voice, it had a lot of voices that had learned to go quiet at the right time. For days afterward, the town moved like it was waiting for thunder. People walked softer, doors closed quicker, conversation stayed low. The wind seemed louder, like it was filling the space where courage used to be. Then, 2 weeks later, Silas Bragg returned. He stepped off the train in fine clothes and a clean hat, carrying himself like a man reborn. He smiled politely at the townsfolk, as if the past were just an argument that had been settled by the proper people. Teo Lujan watched from the depot platform as folks stepped aside without meaning to. It wasn't respect exactly. It was habit. Bragg had trained the town the way men train animals, slow, consistent, and cruel when necessary. That night, Bragg walked into the saloon. Virgil and Everett were already there, eating at a corner table. Lark French sat with them, composed, well-dressed, hands folded as if she'd practiced the posture of survival. She didn't look like a woman who'd been dragged into the desert and used as leverage. She looked like a woman who had decided the past was only useful if it could be reshaped. Bragg approached their table with the mild confidence of a man who believed the world always circled back to him. "Marshal Cole," he said. "Mr. Hitch." Neither Virgil nor Everett stood. Bragg's eyes flicked to Lark, and his smile warmed a fraction, like he was acknowledging something he'd always expected to find in the room. "I'm a free man now," Bragg said. "Paper from the president's people says I've paid what I owe." Virgil met his eyes. "Paper doesn't change what you are." Bragg's smile tightened. "You're still in my town," he said softly, like he was speaking to a child who hadn't learned his place. Virgil tilted his head. "Aloud," he repeated, amused, as if he enjoyed hearing men try to name the shape of power. Lark finally spoke, voice smooth and measured. "Mr. Bragg," she said. "Are you here to start trouble?"
Bragg looked at her. No, ma'am. I'm here to start business. And he did. Within days, Bragg had men laying foundations and hauling lumber. He began building a hotel near the depot. Big, clean, expensive. It went up like a flag, planted in plain view for everyone to see. Travelers started stopping there. Men from Santa Fe visited in neat coats. Money flowed into town in ways Teo couldn't track, which meant it was flowing into pockets that didn't want to be tracked. The banker got friendlier. The council started using words like stability and progress. Folks who'd been afraid of Bragg began to act like they'd always known he was a hard man, but necessary. Virgil watched it happen without pleading and without shouting. He kept doing the job he'd been hired to do, but the town's loyalty began to slide in small, almost invisible ways, like sand shifting under a boot. Everett understood before anyone else did. Rio Seco was turning. Not with a gunfight, not with a riot, just with people choosing what felt safer. Power had returned, and people drifted toward it the way thirsty men drift toward water. Lark drifted too. It started with her playing piano at Bragg's hotel lobby as a courtesy. Then she took meals there. Then Teo saw her disappear upstairs with Bragg one evening like it was the most natural thing in the world. When Everett noticed, he didn't look angry. He looked tired, like he'd always known what kind of person Lark was, and he'd been hoping, against his better judgment, that this time might be different. Virgil didn't say much about it, but Teo saw the change anyway. Virgil's eyes are quieter, his shoulders set heavier, and the hammering on the half-built house out on the edge of town became more precise, as if straight boards and square corners could hold a life together when everything else was slipping. One afternoon, Everett went to Bragg's hotel alone. Teo didn't hear what was said inside, but he saw Everett come out afterward. His face was composed, his eyes were colder. That night, Everett sat outside the marshal's office, listening to the town like a man listens to distant thunder, trying to decide how far away it really is. Teo lingered nearby, pretending he had a reason to be there. Everett spoke softly, more to the dark than to the boy. He offered me a job, Everett said. Teo blinked. Bragg did? Everett nodded. Said the town's moving on, he said. Said Virgil should move on too. Teo swallowed. And if he doesn't? Everett's voice stayed calm, but the words carried weight. Then he'll be moved. A week later, Everett did something Teo never expected. He walked into the saloon and set his deputy badge on the bar. Then he set down his gun. The metal clinked softly, and that sound pulled eyes toward him like a magnet. Rusk, the bartender, stared. What's this? Everett didn't raise his voice. For Bragg, he said. Then he turned and walked out into the street. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady, like he'd already decided the ending and was only making his body catch up. He went straight to Bragg's hotel. Bragg was in the lobby speaking to two well-dressed men who looked like they'd never slept on the ground. When Everett approached, those men started to step back, sensing trouble the way horses sense lightning. Everett didn't wait. He struck Bragg across the face. The crack echoed in the lobby, sharp and ugly. Bragg staggered, shocked more by the insult than the pain. He put a hand to his cheek like he couldn't believe another man had dared to touch him in public. Everett spoke quietly. You wanted my attention, he said. Now you have it. Bragg's eyes flared. You're a dead man, he hissed. Everett hit him again, harder. A small line of blood appeared at the corner of Bragg's mouth. Everett leaned in close, voice even. You'll face me, he said, right now, in the street, or I'll leave town and come back later and kill you when it's inconvenient. That wasn't just a threat, it was a map. Everett was telling Bragg exactly what kind of person he was, and daring Bragg to pretend he didn't understand. Bragg lived on being watched. He fed on respect, fear, and reputation. Everett had forced him into a choice between dying someday or being humiliated today. Bragg chose today. He grabbed a gun and stormed outside. The street filled fast. Folks poured out with the saloon and the general store and the hotel like ants when you disturb a nest. Teo ran with them, heart hammering, because whatever else Everett Hitch was, he wasn't a man who started something and left it unfinished. Everett stood in the dust, waiting. Virgil arrived at the edge of the crowd, moving stiffly from old wounds, face tight with the knowledge of what this could cost. He stepped forward. Everett, he said low, don't. Everett looked at him calmly, as if the world hadn't just tilted. I never asked you for anything, not once. Virgil's jaw clenched. Everett's voice softened just a fraction. I'm asking now. Step aside. For a moment, Virgil didn't move. The wind slid down the street, lifting dust in small spirals. Then Virgil stepped back. One simple step will change everything. Bragg raised the gun with shaking anger and tried to smile through it. You think you can pull on me without coal to back you up, he spat. Everett's supplier was mild. I think you're slow and you're proud. Bragg's hand twitched. Everett fired once. The shot sounded like a door slamming shut in a quiet room. Bragg fell into the dust, surprise still on his face, as if he couldn't believe the world had finally refused him. Everett walked forward, took the gun from Bragg's hand, and calmly reloaded as if finishing a small chore. He didn't look toward the crowd. He didn't look toward the hotel. He didn't look toward Lark. He holstered the pistol, turned, and walked away, leaving Rio Seco standing in the street with the dust settling and the wind moving again, as if it had only paused.
Everett Hitch left Rio Seco the next morning, the way some men leave a battlefield, quietly, like they don't want the land to remember their footsteps. There was no speech, no farewell in the saloon, no last drink to mark the moment. Just the soft sounds of leather and buckles, a saddle being set, a cinch pulled tight. The kind of small, practical noises that mean a decision has already been made, and the only thing left is distance. At the depot, Teo Lujan watched from the platform where he'd first met Virgil Cole and Everett Hitch, back when the town still had nail holes in its door and fear in its throat. The morning air was cool, but it wouldn't stay that way. The sun was already climbing, turning the rails into thin lines of light. Everett sat mounted, steady in the saddle, looking west as if he'd been called by something beyond the horizon. His face didn't show victory. It didn't show regret. Just that calm, sealed expression of a man who'd stepped across a line and accepted the cost. Virgil came out of the marshal's office a moment later, moving a little stiff from old wounds that never truly forgot. He stopped beside Teo without saying anything at first.
He didn't need to. The whole town could feel what had changed overnight. Bragg was dead. The hotel was still standing. The councilmen were still breathing. The wind still moved through the streets like it owned them. And Rio Seco was trying to decide what kind of place it was now. Everett turned his horse slightly and looked back. His eyes met Virgil's across the dust. It wasn't the kind of look people write poems about. It was the look of two men who had stood shoulder to shoulder so long that words had become optional. Virgil finally broke the silence. His voice was low and even, but there was weight behind it. "You didn't have to," he said. Everett's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it didn't quite become one. "No," he replied, "I didn't." He glanced toward the town, toward the new hotel that had risen like a flag, toward the saloon, toward the half-built house on the edge of the street where fresh boards still smelled like sap and hope. Then his gaze drifted back to Virgil. "You'll stay," Everett said, not as a question, more like a fact he'd already accepted. Virgil didn't answer immediately. His eyes slid just briefly to the boarding house steps where Lark French stood in a clean dress, hands folded neatly, face composed the way a person composes themselves when they know they're being judged without a word being spoken. She didn't call out. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She simply waited, close enough to be part of the story, quiet enough to deny responsibility for it. Virgil looked back at Everett. "For now," he said. Everett nodded once. He didn't press. He didn't tease. He didn't offer advice. That wasn't how Everett Hitch operated. He'd learned long ago that people only change when the change is already inside them. Then Everett looked down at Teo, who was standing there trying to act older than he was, trying to be useful in a moment that didn't have a place for boys. "Tell Teo to keep his head down," Everett said, as if Teo weren't standing 2 feet away. Teo bristled. "I keep my head down plenty." Everett's eyes warmed, just a little. It wasn't affection exactly, it was recognition, the kind that says, "I see you trying." "Good," Everett said. "Keep doing it. The world likes to take heads that pop up." Teo swallowed. He wanted to ask the question that had been chewing at him since last night, since the gunshot that dropped Bragg in the dust. "Where will you go?" Teo asked. Everett's gaze returned to the west, where the land opened into distance, and the morning light made the horizon look almost gentle, which was a lie the desert told sometimes. "Wherever there's a town that needs help," Everett said. He paused, then added in a quieter tone, like he was admitting something he didn't say often, "or wherever there isn't." That was the closest thing to a confession Teo ever heard from him. Not about Bragg, not about Lark, about himself. Everett tipped his hat to Virgil. Virgil returned the gesture. No handshake, no embrace. Just that small exchange between men who had shared gunspoken silence, and understood what the other one meant without needing it translated. Then Everett turned his horse and rode out. Not fast, not dramatic, just a steady pace, hooves thudding softly on hard ground, dust rising behind him in a thin, drifting veil. He didn't look back again. He didn't need to. The town watched him go until he became smaller than a man ought to become, until he was nothing but a moving shape against bright land, and then even that disappeared into the shimmer of heat. Teo felt something tighten in his chest. He had grown up believing men like Everett were permanent, like rails and mountains and wind. But out here, even rails ended, especially rails. Virgil remained beside Teo for a moment longer, staring toward the west as if he could still see Everett riding even after he'd vanished. The half-built house waited out on the edge of town. The badge waited. The town waited. All of it hanging on what Virgil chose to do next, even if the people didn't admit that out loud. Behind them, the saloon door opened and closed. Someone laughed, a short nervous sound. Somewhere a hammer struck wood. Life continuing, stubbornly, the way it always did. Lark took a few careful steps toward Virgil, like approaching a wary animal. She stopped close enough for him to feel her presence, but she didn't touch him. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, composed, ready to slip into whatever shape the moment demanded. Virgil didn't turn to her right away. He watched the west one more beat. Eyes narrowed slightly, his face unreadable. Teo couldn't tell whether he was thinking about Everett, or about Bragg, or about the strange math of law out here, how it could be written clean on paper, and still get erased by money or fear. Finally, Virgil exhaled, slow and controlled, as if releasing something he'd been holding since the first day he arrived. Then he turned back toward town. He walked with that slight stiffness in his shoulder, a reminder written into his body. He passed Teo without a word, crossed the street, and went back into the marshal's office. The door shut behind him with a quiet, final sound, not loud enough to start anyone, but heavy enough to feel. Teo stayed on the platform a while longer, watching the street and listening. The wind moved through Rio Seco again, threading between buildings, tugging at loose signs, whispering along the depot boards where old nail holes still lived in the wood. The telegraph wire overhead gave a faint hum, like a distant thought. And Teo, standing there in the morning light, had the unsettling sense that the town was trying to speak without knowing what language it belonged to anymore. Some stories ended with a gunshot. Others ended with a man riding away at an easy pace, heading straight into the wide, empty west, where the horizon promised nothing, and still somehow kept calling.